Hello, my name is Nele de Meijere. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Experimental Psychology. I have a series of hats I wear, and one of them is as the undergraduate admissions coordinator for the undergraduate courses in experimental psychology and psychology, philosophy and linguistics. So I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a course overview in this virtual open day to explain to you what the course looks like and what we really mean when we study psychology. So we see experimental psychology as the science of human beings. That means that we think of human beings as information processors. So we try and understand the working of the human mind and how it develops over the lifespan. So clearly sensory experiences come in, we do a series of processing, and then we produce some form of output. So you can see human beings as information processors, and you can see how the levels and complexity of this may change over time across your life. We also see experimental psychology as the science of human beings in terms of biological organisms. So that means we are trying to understand how our brain works. What is it in our neural workings that underpins this mental life, this information processing, and the broader mental life that we experience. So we do this through a series of techniques using brain imaging examples like we have here, but also more directly neural recordings in animal research, as well as studies looking at natural occurring damage such as stroke, for example. So next, as part of studying human beings and the mental life, we also research and try and understand the causes for psychological disorders. This involves trying to understand when things go wrong, when people experience mental health disorders or developmental disorders, or neurological disorders. So what we are trying to do is understand the causes and the underpinnings of abnormal psychology, as sometimes it might be called, and to also develop evidence-based treatments and research how that works and what makes it work. Finally, psychology is also the science of human beings as they behave in a group. So they are very much actors in a social setting. We as humans don't tend to operate in isolation, in a vacuum, and so the way we act and think and react is often influenced by the many people around us, both in closer circles and in wider circles. And so part of psychology is this social cognition and social interactions and social psychology. So in brief, if we have to try and put it all together, we'd say we are trying to understand people as biological organisms, as information processors, and as social actors, and try and understand how all these things come together. This brings us on briefly to the role of comparison in seeing and thinking. So psychology, the way we teach it here in Oxford, is as part of experimental psychology, you will have seen. And I often get asked, so what is experimental? Why experimental? And one of the reasons is we really very much see this as a science within the medical sciences division, which is also the division we sit in psychology. And the experimental nature is to try and understand the mechanisms underlying things like seeing and thinking. So if we think of the role of comparison, it's crucial. So on a very basic level, even when you're trying to judge the brightness of the grey square in the middle, you may find that you're influenced by the darkness or the lightness of the surround, and perhaps you may find that the one with the lighter surround looks darker than the one with the darker surround, even though they are exactly the same. Another interesting way of looking at psychology is to look at comparisons over time. So this is another example from a very standard perception task. And I'd like you to try this with me, and maybe if you haven't got your screen on full size screen yet, maybe now's a good time to do it. And the task is to just look at the little blue dot in the center of the screen. So keep your eyes fixed on the blue dot and try not to move it and try not to blink too much. So whilst I'm still trying to talk to you and filling the time, I'm hoping you are still just watching that dot. So I'm going to count down and make it change. So hold on, don't move your eyes. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I'm hoping if you still got your eyes on that dot, you are seeing a lovely color picture, but once you move your eyes away, you will find that the illusion has disappeared. So now the thing to say is that I've not changed this picture. This was always a grayscale picture and never had any color in it. The perception of color that you hopefully all experience, if not, rewind, try again, is that of an after image. And so this after image is not what is physically in the world, and part of what we teach in psychology is also the very what sometimes might be considered very basic perception. People always think that what they see is very much influenced by the physical reality, but in effect there's quite a lot of what we see that's determined by our brain rather than our eyes. So if we now look on the very other end of the spectrum in psychology and look at social psychology and how perhaps things and other people are influencing what we perceive and what we make as choices. So this is a standard experiment. It's called the ultimatum game, and maybe you've heard of it, but it goes like this. If you're being asked whether you would prefer £2 or nothing, most people around here would say, yep, give me the £2, because objectively getting £2 is better than nothing. However, when we play this ultimatum game and we say we're going to award £100 to you and the stranger, and it's up to the stranger to decide how much they choose to offer you, and they get to keep the rest. Crucially, you can reject the offer, and when you reject the offer, both people get nothing. So what would you do now if you're being asked, would you prefer £2 or nothing, knowing that the split would be £98 to the other person and £2 to you? So what you'll find is that a lot of people, although the rational choice surely remains £2 being better than nothing, most people will reject this kind of offer, and most people will say this is not fair. And so the way we make choices and the way we make rational choices is very much influenced by comparisons to other people and the sense of fairness. Okay, next I want to talk to you briefly about some of the research that is going on at experimental psychology. The research is very much what's informing our teaching and is core of our activities in the department. So we are a world-leading experimental scientific research department, and we do research both in terms of fundamental research, which is more about trying to understand the mechanisms that underlie our mental life, but also we do quite a fair bit of translational research, which is about translating this kind of evidence of fundamental research to clinical practice, including mental health, but also to wider societal benefits around education, policy making and industry. So next is a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of our research centres, where some of the research goes on in experimental psychology. So some of this is clearly around neuroimaging and neural interference techniques. So the images you see here are some of the centres where we do neuroimaging research in terms of MRI and functional MRI recordings, EEG. TMS is where we use transcranial magnetic stimulation to disrupt temporarily some of the neuronal activity. Underneath there you can see an example of TDCS, which is transcranial direct current stimulation, which is used to pass a small current through the brain to sustain some small but nevertheless significant changes in terms of neuronal underlying activity. And then finally an MEG example. So these are all types of techniques that are being used by several of the researchers and professors that will be teaching you as part of this course. Next, some of our more translational research centres. So that's the Cognitive Neuropsychology Centre and Oxcadat. where a lot of the translational research goes on in terms of one of them being around stroke research and diagnostics for cognitive problems, and therapies for anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress disorders. So both of these are very closely interlinked with the Oxford Health NHS Foundation Trust and OUH NHS Trust. So we do a lot of joint work with the hospital settings and the community settings. Next up is some of our developmental research examples. So we have a baby lab where we study the developments of babies and language. Then there is the attention, brain and cognitive development lab, which is particularly looking at early development around attention, also looking at some disorders like ADHD and autism. And then we have a whole group that works around reading development. We also have some research centres in behavioural neurosciences as part of the biomedical sciences building. And I thought it's worth explaining to you, because although you will not ever be asked to take part or to do any research involving animals, this is part of the course, and you will learn about studies done on mice and rats and monkeys. A lot of the research that goes on is allowing us to do direct intracranial recordings and neural recordings directly into the brain, and to try and understand the homologues between, for example, the primates and our human research by also having equivalent scanners. So there is an MRI scanner for the primate center as well as obviously the human MRI scanning. So in terms of the teaching at experimental psychology, we teach in several formats. So we'll teach you in terms of lectures and large group teaching, but also in smaller group sessions. So our tutorials are typically 2 to 3 students and 1 tutor. But we also teach you in labs, and so we'll teach you experiments, analysis techniques, coding experiments, how to collect data, how to analyze data, and so forth. Really the key message here is that what we're trying to foster is a deep, critical and creative teaching style. So it will not be surprising to you to hear that we fare quite well in terms of rankings. So our department and the university tend to be ranked 1 in most of the ranking scales. Okay, so the course now has 4 different options, and these are the associated course codes on UCAS. So it's important to note that for those first 3 course codes, at the entry point, students are admitted to the integrated master's course. So this Master of Sciences in Experimental Psychology, with options to do joint courses in Psychology and Philosophy and Psychology and Linguistics. Because the masterized year is in psychology, the Philosophy and Linguistics course combination remains a 3-year course with its separate course code. However, it should be very clearly noted that in any of those first 3 integrated master's courses, you can apply and still choose to exit at the end of 3 years. So anyone who still wants to do only a 3-year course can still do so. The bachelor degree, which you then get at the end of 3 years, also still carries BPS accreditation for those who may wish to pursue clinical or psychology training and qualifications. So the elective decision point at which students then have to confirm whether or not they wish to progress to 4 years or exit after year 3 is the final term of year 2, known in Oxford as Trinity term. So this progression onto the 4th year depends solely and only on student preference. So for those who wish to continue to 4 years, but whose interim mark perhaps is low at the end of the year 2 examinations, the course will have an advisory process with associated mentoring to ensure the level necessary for 4th year research can be achieved. So this is then the main structure of the course, with year 1 focused on foundational knowledge and skills, and in Oxford terms this is known as the prelims part. So the prelims lectures will be in 3 or 5 topics depending on your chosen course of EP or specific combination within PPL. The one thing that you can be sure of that it will include is statistics. More on that later. The exams at the end of year 1 need to be passed to move on to the rest of the course, but the marks are not included in your final degree classification. Then year 2 is centered around core knowledge and skill development in 5 areas of psychology, or if you're doing PPL, this will be fewer than 5, and additionally, you will have some core teaching in philosophy and linguistics. Again, you have exams at the end of the year. Year 3 then sees you taking advanced topics, an optional library dissertation, and more research skills training via group projects this time. If you're going on to the 4th year, the final term of year 3 is also when project ethics need to be completed. So you have a full 3 terms available to do the research in your final year. This will be then the key element here in this final year, working on research independence with an extended project where you'll be spending most of your time in the lab group from your project supervisors. You will also be having further advanced skills training and be working on writing a current opinion piece in this 4th year. Okay, so here's then a little bit more detail on what those 4 years look like in terms of subjects and assessments you're doing if you choose experimental psychology. So this is the EP overview in terms of what is being assessed and how much of your final degree mark is then garnered at each point. FHS, by the way, is another abbreviation often used and stands for the Final Honours School. So here's the same then for PPL, with weightings represented for an equal split of psychology and either philosophy or linguistics. You don't have to do an equal split, and you could choose to do a higher proportion of either psychology, philosophy or linguistics. However, there are some constraints if you are doing a joint degree and you wish to obtain the BPS accreditation. You basically have to take a sufficient amount of psychology. So I'll just break it down a little bit more year by year now. In the first year, so the prelims, you have these 5 topics, and if you're doing experimental psychology, you typically take Introduction to Psychology, Introduction to Neurophysiology, and Introduction to Stats. If you do Psychology and Philosophy, you swap Neurophys out for Philosophy. If you're doing Psychology and Linguistics, you swap it out for Linguistics. And if you're doing philosophy and linguistics, you don't do any psychology, but instead do philosophy, linguistics, and statistics. So you'll notice that the only thing that has stayed stable throughout is that you have to do stats. That's because both psychology and linguistics require you to have a foundational knowledge of statistics to move on to the rest of the course. So when you then look at that specific part of psychology, within that you'll get an introduction to developmental psychology, social psychology, sensory processes, psychobiology, and cognitive psychology. Then year 2 is the core year. So basically we cover 5 core areas. One is biological psychology, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, social psychology, and individual differences. So those 5 core topics then make up the second year for psychology. Now, what does a typical week in year 2 maybe look like? So you'll have some lectures, 1 or 2 a day. You'll have some tutorials, typically something like 3 over 2 weeks. You'll be discussing your essay work. So this is the tutorial system. So you'll have 2 to 3 students in a group with a tutor going over and discussing the topics that were set. You'll also have some practical classes for skill development in experimental research methods and statistics. And then you can do an optional research seminar as well. There is lots and lots of them, but the department hosts a really nice research seminar. And typically those mean you get to hear from really leading figures in the field. So then your third year, your advanced year, this is where you have advanced options. So these are small group teaching. So typically 12 students in a class. They go into a lot of detail in any of those kind of standard areas. But note, you can also take papers in other schools, a paper in neurosciences or a paper in linguistics or philosophy, and so forth. And here are some examples on the advanced options. So these are things that have run before. So we don't, it's almost impossible to say what will be running in, by the time you guys arrive and get to your third year, because it gets updated and it changes, but this is just to give you a little bit of flavor. So aside from these advanced options, you'll also be doing some group projects. So again, these are kind of experimental setups that you run, but rather than you on your own as you do in your final year, you run it as a group, so you get those skills in a set group projects. Okay, so on to year 4. This is where you'll be mainly doing your extended projects, and you'll also be writing a current opinion piece, which is really drafting on all the most current literature and the cutting edge research, so you can form an opinion on what kind of progress is being made and maybe needs to be made further, as well as some advanced skills training. This can be in writing publications, further statistical methods, open science, and so forth. So at the end of the 4th year, there is no exams, but you have to then hand in this project that you've been working on for a whole year, as well as your current opinion piece. So this extended research project really is an original piece of research. So it's yours, it's not being done by anyone else, and you conduct it in this final year. And at the end, you write it up in a fully fledged research article. And some of these get published even with first authorship to the undergraduate researchers. So it is really an original piece of research contributing to the body of work and literature that's out there. So here are some project examples from previous years. Again, what happens is you get a list to choose from if you wish. So supervisors will put forth topics that they suggest, questions that they suggest. But at the same time, if you have your own really unique idea and you really want to do a project on something very specific, then you're more than welcome to express and write to a supervisor that could supervise it. So you do need to find someone who's close enough in that area and knows enough about it to be able to supervise it. But you can come up completely with your own ideas, and usually people are very, very happy to discuss those. So you don't have to pick from a list. You can do as you wish, or you can start with an idea on a list. I think that quite often happens, and then you form it and transform it in something that's more personal to you. That is it really for the course overview. So any questions? We have a whole bunch of videos up there on the student perspective, the admissions process, separate videos for philosophy and linguistics. There's a mock interview in case you want to know what interviews are like. And then we recorded a whole bunch of Q&A sessions where so myself, Dave Leal, who's the coordinator for philosophy, and the coordinators for linguistics, as well as a bunch of our on-course students respond to questions that people have asked us. So you can go there and just kind of look through all of it. There's a lot, so you may want to just look at specific questions you have. They're all in the comments, so you can click on it and it'll fast forward to that time points. More links to the EP pages and our email for any further questions, admissions@psy.ox.ac.uk. Thank you very much.